She arrived in Toronto as the 25th seed, with an entire nation watching her every move. But Alex Eala was no longer leaving the tournament as simply a promising young player. She was leaving as a giant killer. 7 straight wins, 2 tournaments, an 8-match winning streak, and now a historic place in the quarterfinals of a WTA 1000 event. The Eala Express had just rolled through another major obstacle. And this time, the player standing in its path was an Olympic gold medalist. But what made this achievement even more remarkable was everything Alex had endured just to reach this stage. Her ankle was still throbbing after a brutal 2-hour and 39-minute battle against Katie McNally. She had rolled the ankle, called for a medical timeout, had the tape ripped off in desperation, and somehow still found a way to finish the match. Lesser players might have stopped right there. Alex kept fighting. By then, she had extended her winning streak to 7 matches, the longest winning streak of her career at that point, while also reaching the 4th round of a WTA 1000 tournament for the first time since her breakout run at the Miami Open in 2025. But there was no time to celebrate because waiting across the net was a player with an Olympic gold medal, 9 WTA titles, 2 Grand Slam semifinal appearances, and years of experience competing on the biggest stages in tennis. Belinda Bencic was not simply another opponent. She was the kind of player who had already experienced many of the things Alex was dreaming of achieving. Bencic had reached a career-high ranking of world number 4, captured the Tokyo 2020 Olympic singles gold medal, reached the semifinals of the 2019 US Open and 2025 Wimbledon, and had even won the Toronto tournament back in 2015. The matchup had everything. On one side stood a 21-year-old Filipina sensation riding the hottest streak of her career. On the other was a battle-tested Swiss champion who knew exactly what it took to survive when the pressure became unbearable. And remarkably, the two had never faced each other before. There was no previous match between them to study from personal experience, no history, and no psychological advantage waiting to be exploited. This was a completely new chapter. For Alex, the challenge was obvious. Bencic possessed one of the most complete games on tour. She could redirect pace, absorb pressure, change rhythm, move extremely well, and punish even the smallest opening. She had spent more than a decade competing against the best players in the world, while Alex was still writing the earliest major chapters of her professional career. But there was one thing Bencic could not afford to overlook. Alex had already proven that she belonged in these moments. She had defeated Olympic gold medalists. She had defeated Grand Slam champions. She had even defeated the world number 3. Her growing record against top 10 opponents had become impossible to dismiss, with 9 victories over top 10 players and 7 of those wins coming during 2026 alone. This was no longer a young player getting lucky against established names. Alex Eala was becoming a serious threat to them. The only question was whether her body would allow her to continue. The ankle injury from the McNally match was still a major concern, and everyone knew it. Alex herself had admitted that the injury happened so quickly that she barely understood what had gone wrong. Yet after receiving medical attention, she returned to the court and completed the job. That resilience became one of the defining themes of her Toronto run. She was not winning because everything was going perfectly. She was winning because whenever something went wrong, she kept finding another solution. And then came the atmosphere. More than 10,000 fans packed into the stadium, and the sound was unlike anything Alex had experienced on that stage before. Philippine flags filled the stands. Filipino supporters turned the arena into a sea of national pride, and every point Alex won was met with an eruption from the crowd. Toronto was beginning to feel less like an away tournament and more like a homecoming. But beneath all the noise and celebration, Alex still had a job to finish. Across the net stood an Olympic champion with the experience, weapons, and composure to punish any hesitation. Alex had already survived the physical pain, the pressure, and the expectations. Now she had to prove that she could overcome another champion and keep the Eala Express moving forward. And what happened next would show just how far this young Filipina star had truly come. The stands were already shaking with energy as fans shouted, "Let's go, Alex!" It sounded less like a tennis match and more like a championship football game. For Toronto's enormous Filipino community, this was about much more than another tennis match. It was a moment of representation. Alex was no longer competing only for herself. She was carrying the hopes, pride, and excitement of a community that had watched her grow from a promising young prospect into one of the most talked about players in the sport. And now, the matchup everyone had been waiting for was finally here. Olympic champion against Filipina sensation. Veteran against rising star. Experience against fearless momentum. From the moment the first ball was struck, it became clear that Alex had not come to Toronto simply to participate. She had come to make a statement. Bencic entered the match with every reason to believe she could control the contest. She had just survived an exhausting marathon against Taylor Townsend, a battle that lasted more than 3 hours and saw Bencic save match points before eventually escaping with the victory. That match had tested her physically and mentally, but the Swiss star had once again found a way through. She knew how to survive. She knew how to remain calm when everything was falling apart, and she knew how to turn matches around when the pressure was at its highest. But Alex refused to let Bencic settle into her preferred rhythm. Instead of allowing the Olympic champion to dictate the rallies, Alex made her work for every single point. She extended exchanges, absorbed the pace, redirected the ball, and patiently waited for the right moment to attack. This was not reckless tennis. It was calculated tennis. Alex understood that she did not need to overpower Bencic on every point. She simply needed to stay composed, trust her patterns, and force the Olympic champion to earn everything. And that was exactly what she did. Bencic tried to use her experience to take control, but Alex repeatedly answered with precision. Whenever the Swiss star attempted to change the rhythm, Alex adjusted. Whenever Bencic applied pressure, Alex absorbed it. And whenever an opening appeared, Alex attacked without hesitation. The ankle that had been such a major question mark suddenly seemed like an afterthought. Her movement was decisive. Her concentration never disappeared, and her body language showed absolutely no fear. As the match progressed, one thing became increasingly obvious. Alex was not intimidated by the name across the net. She was playing the opponent in front of her, not the Olympic medal around her neck. That distinction was crucial. Bencic had the resume, but Alex had the momentum. And momentum can become incredibly powerful when a player begins to believe that nothing can stop her. Alex had already defeated elite opponents throughout her rise, and every major victory had added another layer of confidence. Now she was facing another champion, yet instead of shrinking under the occasion, she appeared to become even more comfortable with every passing game. Her strategy was simple, but executing it under this kind of pressure was anything but easy. Take the match 1 point at a time. Alex later explained that this mentality was one of the keys to her performance. She did not allow herself to think about Bencic's Olympic gold medal. She did not think about the Swiss star's former world number 4 ranking. She did not think about the significance of reaching the quarterfinals. She focused on the next point, then the next, and then the next. That mindset allowed her to remain composed even as the pressure continued to rise. Eventually, that pressure became too much for Bencic. The Swiss star, who had survived countless battles throughout her career, simply could not find enough answers for Alex's consistency, movement, and fearless shot-making. And then came the final point. Suddenly, the reality became impossible to ignore. Alex Eala had defeated an Olympic gold medalist in straight sets. The Filipina sensation had taken down a former world number 4, a player with 9 WTA titles, 2 Grand Slam semifinal appearances, and an Olympic championship on her resume. Alex dropped her racket, raised her arms, and allowed the moment to sink in. The crowd erupted. Philippine flags waved throughout the stadium, and the noise became deafening. What had started as a 4th-round match had transformed into something much bigger. Alex had just booked her place in the quarterfinals of a WTA 1000 tournament for the first time in her career. But this victory was not simply about reaching the next round. It was proof that her incredible run was real. The 7-match winning streak was not a fluke. The confidence was not temporary. And the giant killer reputation was no longer just a catchy nickname. Alex Eala was becoming the kind of player that established champions had to fear. The Washington title was not some isolated breakthrough. The victories over elite opponents were not accidents. Alex Eala was becoming a legitimate contender at the highest level of the sport, and the context made her Toronto run even more impressive. She had arrived in Canada carrying the physical demands of a grueling tournament schedule, and then the ankle injury threatened to derail everything. Instead, she kept winning. Her Toronto campaign began with a gritty victory over Alicia Parks, giving Alex the chance to avenge an earlier Australian Open defeat. Then came Katie McNally, a player who had just stunned reigning Wimbledon champion Linda Noskova. Alex battled through more than 2.5 hours of intense tennis, survived the frightening ankle scare, and somehow found a way to advance. And then came Belinda Bencic, another champion, another major test, another victory. Every round presented a completely different challenge, and every time, Alex found another answer. But perhaps the most extraordinary part of the story was not even what was happening on the court. It was what was happening in the stands. Toronto's Filipino community had transformed the atmosphere into something completely different. More than 10,000 fans packed the stadium. Philippine flags appeared throughout the arena, and chants of "Let's go, Alex" shook the building. Fans arrived carrying signs celebrating Alex's rise, with messages about believing, fighting, and representing. One supporter even brought a sign, essentially saying that bedtime could wait because cheering for Alex was more important. Another fan proudly held Canadian and Philippine flags together, perfectly capturing the unique atmosphere surrounding the match. This was no longer simply a crowd supporting a tennis player. It was an entire community watching one of its own make history. The energy was so intense that commentators compared the noise to the kind of atmosphere normally reserved for a Grand Slam victory. Play-by-play commentator Mark Pecci captured the feeling, describing the sound as the type of noise you would expect during a Grand Slam win. And that statement said everything about what Alex had created. This was only a 4th-round match in Toronto, yet she had transformed it into something that felt like a national sporting event. Toronto's Filipino community had embraced Alex, and Alex embraced them right back. After the match, she walked toward the crowd and formed a heart with her hands, acknowledging the supporters who had stood behind her throughout the night. It was a simple gesture, but it carried enormous meaning. Alex understood what this moment represented. She knew that people had traveled, waited, shouted, waved flags, and filled the stadium because they wanted to witness history with her. When she spoke after the match, Alex talked about feeling at home in Toronto and explained just how special the support had been. She thanked the crowd and promised to keep fighting, keep believing, and keep representing. The response was immediate. Fans remained on their feet. Philippine flags continued waving, and the chants continued as Alex's quarterfinal dream became reality. For the Filipino community, it was a moment to celebrate, but for tennis fans around the world, it was also a warning. Alex Eala was no longer just a promising young player with potential. She was becoming one of the most dangerous emerging names on the tour. The victory over Bencic proved that she could handle experience. It proved that she could handle pressure. It proved that she could fight through physical problems. But most importantly, it proved that she could walk onto one of the biggest stages in tennis, look across the net at an Olympic champion, hear thousands of people screaming her name, and still perform as if she belonged there. That is one of the hardest transitions for any young athlete. Talent can get you noticed, but confidence under pressure is what allows you to survive at the highest level. And Alex was developing that confidence in real time. She was learning how to handle the expectations that came with her rapid rise. And instead of allowing those expectations to overwhelm her, she appeared to be using them as fuel. The 7-match winning streak had now become 8, the longest winning streak of her career. She had gone from Washington champion to Toronto giant killer. She had defeated an Olympic champion and reached the quarterfinals of one of the biggest tournaments on the calendar. And suddenly, the conversation around Alex changed. The question was no longer whether she could compete with the best players in the world. She had already answered that question. The new question was much more exciting. How far could she actually go? Because waiting for her in the quarterfinals was another enormous challenge. Coco Gauff, the number 4 seed, was watching Alex's rise with interest. And Gauff had already acknowledged the impact Alex was having on tennis. She pointed out that the new audience and demographic Alex was bringing into the sport was something tennis should embrace, because Alex was doing more than winning matches. She was bringing an entire new wave of fans into the game. And now, with a quarterfinal against one of the biggest stars in women's tennis waiting ahead, Alex Eala had another chance to prove that her incredible run was only getting started. Everyone benefits when new audiences become passionate about the game, and perhaps that was the biggest story behind Alex Eala's rise. She was not just winning matches, she was creating new fans, bringing Filipino supporters into stadiums, inspiring young players around the world, and proving that tennis can belong to anyone willing to fight for a place at the top. Her story had already gone far beyond a single tournament. The Canadian Open was becoming another major chapter in a season that had already included a title in Washington, statement victories over elite opponents, and a growing reputation as one of the most fearless young competitors on tour. With every victory, the next challenge seemed to get bigger. And with every challenge, Alex seemed to become stronger. But before looking ahead, it was worth understanding exactly what she had accomplished in Toronto. Alex had entered the tournament as the 25th seed, carrying expectations, but certainly not the kind normally placed on the favorites. She was viewed as a dangerous young player who might make a deep run if everything went her way. Instead, things went wrong at several different moments, and she kept winning anyway. She dealt with physical problems, survived marathon matches, faced experienced opponents, and handled the enormous pressure of thousands of fans watching her every move. Through all of it, she continued moving forward. That was why the victory over Belinda Bencic felt so significant. It was not simply a straight-set victory over a famous opponent. It was evidence of a player developing before our eyes. Alex was beginning to understand how to manage difficult matches without panicking. She was learning how to use her strengths against different styles of play. Most importantly, she was starting to understand that the biggest names in tennis were not unbeatable. They were simply opponents. And once a young player reaches that mental point, everything can change. The crowd in Toronto had witnessed that transformation firsthand. They had watched a young Filipina player step onto the court carrying an ankle injury, facing an opponent with an Olympic gold medal and years of experience, and then walk away as the winner. The eruption after the final point was more than excitement. It was pride, relief, disbelief, and joy all at once. Fans who had followed Alex from the beginning were watching a moment they had dreamed about for years. The Filipino community had been waiting for a star who could channel their passion for sport into tennis, and Alex was becoming exactly that player. Comparisons to Manny Pacquiao began appearing because of the combination of youth, charisma, talent, and the powerful connection she was building with Filipino fans. But Alex was creating her own identity. She was not trying to become another athlete. She was becoming Alex Eala. And the tennis world was beginning to understand exactly what that meant. Her personality, fighting spirit, competitive mentality, and willingness to represent her country were becoming just as important to her story as her forehand, backhand, or serve. Perhaps that was why the atmosphere in Toronto felt so different. People were not simply watching a tennis match anymore. They were watching a movement begin. A young player from the Philippines was reaching stages that few Filipino tennis players had reached before, and an entire community was seeing itself reflected in her journey. That is the power of sport when an athlete becomes more than an athlete. Alex's victory over Bencic had all the ingredients of a genuine breakthrough moment. A legendary opponent, a difficult physical situation, massive crowd support, high stakes, and a young player who refused to be overwhelmed by any of it. She had not simply survived. She had taken control. And now, with the quarterfinals waiting, the stakes were about to become even higher. The Canadian Open was no longer a surprise run. It was becoming a serious title challenge. The Elo Express was moving faster than anyone expected, and there was no sign that it was ready to slow down. Alex had already shown that she could defeat champions. She had shown that she could handle pressure. She had shown that she could play through adversity. Now she had the opportunity to prove that she could go deep into a WTA 1000 tournament against the very best players in the world. That was the next test. And if this season had taught tennis fans anything, it was that counting Alex out was becoming a very dangerous mistake. From the moment she arrived in Toronto, she carried the expectations of a nation. But with every victory, those expectations were transforming into belief. That belief was spreading from the Philippines to Toronto, from the stands to social media, and from fans to players across the tour. Alex was no longer quietly knocking on the door of elite tennis. She had kicked it open. The Olympic champion was beaten. The quarterfinal ticket was secured. The winning streak had reached 8. And thousands of Filipino fans had witnessed another historic moment. Now, the entire tennis world was waiting to see what would happen next. Because when a 21-year-old player from the Philippines enters a WTA 1000 tournament as the 25th seed and suddenly finds herself in the quarterfinals after defeating an Olympic gold medalist, the story is no longer about potential. It is about arrival. Alex Eala had arrived. And if the Elo Express was already moving this fast, the biggest question was no longer whether it could continue. The question was how far it could possibly go. Toronto had become her stage. The Filipino supporters had become her wall of energy. And every match from this point forward would bring more pressure, more attention, and greater expectations. But Alex had already shown that she could handle all three. The road was only going to get harder. Cincinnati was waiting. The US Open was waiting. The biggest names in women's tennis were waiting. But after what Alex had just done against Belinda Bencic, nobody could look at this young Filipina sensation as an outsider anymore. She had earned her place. She had earned the respect of her opponents. She had earned the roar of the crowd. And most importantly, she had earned the right to believe that anything was possible. The Elo Express was still rolling, the world was watching, and the next stop was the quarterfinals.